Okay, dear Europeana followers, I will start my timer. I have been promised a sudden but painful death by the Master of Ceremonies if I shall not finish on time, so I put my own watch here. The session that I'm introducing is session number 2. It's called Aggregation and Metadata Quality, and it's a very important part of Europeana as it kind of forms the entire content of what we're dealing with. We're forming applications, we're forming infrastructures, but all of it kind of is meaningless unless there is content providers and content traveling along the routes that we're designing. My criminal record in the Europeana history is down to a sentence of 3 years for, what could you call it, gross misconduct of proposal writing back in 2007 when we wrote a proposal called Europeana Local. This one has led me through a tremendous amount of interesting meetings, pain, sweat, fear, and eventually relief in working with Europeana. Now, the journey that we are going to go on is a travel on the path that content takes from its content providers through aggregators, through reuse, and having a critical look at ourselves. Any good journey should have a guide, and while Norwegians traditionally have been traveling quite a bit and have been good guides, my family has sadly been living, working, and probably more disturbingly, procreating and marrying within 6 square kilometers for more than 400 years. As a consequence, I have been forced to look a little bit wider when I'm trying to find people to aid me in guiding you on this journey. As a consequence, we have an agenda which consists of speakers from several different European countries, some with untainted views ready to fire at us from outside, some of us from the inside. So, the first thing we'll look at is content. We will take a look at metadata itself. It is designed for certain purposes, it's designed for certain target audiences. We have the Europeana data model. We have, in modern families, there's usually more than one father. At least one of them is with us here to present his baby, the EDM. And we have an entirely outside view where we will try to look at metadata from someone who hasn't crossed swords with Europeana at this stage. The lead talk will be given by Professor Franziska de Jong, who will give an inspired talk under the name "There is no data like metadata." She has not, as of yet, been tainted by our views and ideas in Europeana, and it will be very interesting to see her perspective on metadata design in the context of user requirements compared to what has come into existence over the past years in Europeana. We have Professor Stefan Gradmann, who will talk about the opportunities of the Europeana data model, our, what could you say, our holy grail of metadata, which we are all targeting to deliver to. And with these two, we are kind of going to set the frame for the content. The next thing we're going to look at is content aggregation. We have now prepared the content, we have our beautiful metadata. How do we establish sustainable infrastructures for aggregation? How do we manage to make this run? How do we manage to make sure that once new content comes to, we manage to capture it, that this is not a one-time exercise, something that falls out? So, we have presentations for this. Obviously, once we start to use our content in a completely different context from what it was created for, our cataloging was initially mainly for analog purposes and going to archives, finding things in an analog context. Once we start using this in the digital sphere, we find a lot of issues which we need to correct. So content enrichment becomes an important issue. We have another slightly more traveled, less static Norwegian than myself, Mr. Gunnar Østegård, who is going to deliver a presentation on how to establish national infrastructures with examples from Norway, where he has been trying and fighting these battles for the greater part of 20 years. So slightly preceding Europeana. We are also going, and I'm presenting people from their actually home now, not where they necessarily live at the moment, but where they're from. We also have Mr. Nuno Freire from the Europeana Foundation and formerly IST, who is doing a presentation on information extraction in metadata, challenges and tools available for this particular purpose. This is a responsibility that lies as close as possible to the content providers, Once data comes into Europeana, the amount of guessing you can do based on the original context in these data was created are very limited. So, an important topic. Having aggregated our content, the next step is how to use it, how to reuse it. All our talks this morning has been on openness and on preservation, trying to see how can we get this content into a stable position where others can exploit it. And we therefore have a session devoted to use and reuse. One is how to explore this rich content once you have created it. We have a huge amount of linked data. We can use some kind of graph browsers, and we can sit following these graphs and make nice presentations, of course, but how to actually exploit this. So we have one presentation looking into this. We have one presentation looking into how the EDM works once applied to a specific thematic domain. So we're trying to test run the EDM in the domain of archaeology. And with a little bit of luck, we managed to get a proper standoff between Stefan Gradmann and Fernie. It would be interesting. And we have a session on the semantic web. How do we align with the semantic web what comes out in the other end? So for this, Mr. Mark Hall from the University of Sheffield, currently active on the PATHS project, is going to deliver a speech on how to aggregate dynamic cultural heritage collections using automatically generated topic hierarchies, working on the entire data volume of Europeana. It's an interesting approach. We have Fernie, project manager of a lot of things, and in this context, specifically for the Carrara project, who is going to tell us how the EDM works once applied to the Carrara domain of archaeology. I believe also the Master of Ceremony would be able to add quite a bit of detail on that one, so we could manage to get some heat. Mr. Paul Hermans, a well-known profile and excellent speaker on issues related to the semantic web, will enlighten us on where we stand in relation to the semantic web once we have completed our journey in Europeana. The final step that we should conduct before we close our circle is the evaluation. What is the state of what we have achieved so far? We have wandered through a landscape of standards, which is now becoming so complicated that you need kind of standards for which standards to choose. It's a very complicated matter to understand, even the simplest standards at this stage. And we have Mr. Phil Archer from the World Wide Web Consortium to giving us an introduction to a set of the different World Wide Web standards and how they apply to the process that we are trying to conduct here. Finally, also this session has a panel discussion. It will also consist of all the members of the speakers of the sessions, and the purpose of this one is to have a critical look at ourselves. We are spending quite a lot of energy into establishing manually crafted metadata. We are trying to sculpt our formats, convey a significant amount of detail through our data. But at the same time, we still keep using the search engines and their indexing, which is based on automatic means. This is not a session which is targeted at trying to find areas where we have failed, but it's mainly an issue of trying to look critically at ourselves and see how can we benefit in our approach from looking at our, mainstream competition in the commercial sector. That would be what I have to say, and I have finished 1 minute and 36 seconds early, which should make the Master of Ceremonies very happy.